Good morning, everybody. I apologize for a little bit of a technical delay here, so I thought we'll get a little bit going with the program, but I guess we'll start on time as I was meant to start at 10 o'clock. Thank you to Phyllis and Roger and Katie and Kimberly for the kind invitation to speak to you this morning about what we do at the Institute and what kind of research that you might find useful for your everyday work. So just before I start with my main subject matter, just to introduce who we are, what we do. Canadian Energy Research Institute was founded in 1975. We're a non-for-profit independent research organization, and we specialize in economic and environmental analysis of all energy matters in Canada and other global markets, oil and gas, energy markets that have an impact on the Canadian energy systems. Our mission is to provide relevant, objective, and independent research. We do produce a number of research reports a year that are publicly available to you on our website, but we also do monthly reports on natural gas, crude oil, and electricity, and we host 3 annual conferences a year. We are a fully funded institute. Our main funders are Department of Energy with Province of Alberta, Natural Resources Canada, and Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. We also receive support from the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada, Industrial Alberta Heartland, the Government of Saskatchewan, and University of Calgary. We receive in-kind support. Well, you just heard Mark speak. PSAC is one of our in-kind supporters, Alberta Energy Regulator, as well as the Advisian of Willie Parsons division. All right, so what was I tasked to talk to you? I'm going to sort of jump away from the technical side and from the technology and services more into sort of do a bird's eye view, a macroeconomic view of Alberta oil sands in terms of its economic impact on the Canadian economy. But it doesn't come with its own challenges. So it does have a certain list and factors that are being influential in how fast and how sustainable oil sands industry grows. Most of my presentation are results of our recently published reports. And as I mentioned, they are publicly available. In front of you, there is a 2-pager summary information sheet of the most recent report we just published in August. And this one looks at the economic impacts of Canadian oil and gas development in the Canadian economy, as well as the US, which is quite important right now and timely given where the negotiations, the trade negotiations are going on with NAFTA. All right, so let's jump straight into the meaty and greedy of the presentation. So what you see here is the Canadian crude oil production for the last, sorry if I'm blocking, from 2009 to last year. As you see, Canadian crude oil production is continuing to grow, albeit minus a little dip in 2016, where production stood at 3.9 million barrels per day. The majority of the Canadian oil production does come from the Alberta bitumen and upgraded synthetic crude oil volumes. The oil sands production last year stood at almost 2.5 million barrels per day out of the total 3.8 million barrels. Some of the other areas where crude oil is being developed and produced is in offshore Atlantic Canada, little small volumes from Manitoba and Ontario, and the majority does come from the Western Canadian provinces of British Columbia, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And this is quite sort of interactive. If you have any questions, you know, you can wait till the end of the presentation, or you can just raise your hand and ask away. All right, so jumping into the energy exports. In 2016, US was the largest trading partner for Canada. The trading volumes amounted to $752 billion US. Out of that total volume, about $392 billion were in Canadian exports, and the rest were goods and services that Canada imported from US. A significant component of Canadian exports are our energy commodities. So this is specifically natural gas, crude oil, and bitumen. What you see here are the US imports from Canada by type of crude. And as you can see, in 2016, out of the total 3.8, 3.9 million barrels per day that Canada produced, 3.3 million barrels were exported to the United States. The largest market that imports Canadian crude is the Midwest, PAD 2 region, as you can see here. And the volumes, the type of crude that the US seeks from Canada is within the sort of heavy sour classification. So this would be your extra heavy conventional production, but also the non-upgraded bitumen. So the dilbit volumes that are moving through the pipeline systems, through rail, and some of the volumes are even making it to the Gulf region by pipeline and then down the barge on the Mississippi River. All right, so where are we at today? So sort of the quick synopsis of the latest headlines from our traditional news media, as well as some of the social media that we're seeing. What we're seeing right now is this sort of social acceptance from various groups, environmental groups. The governments, provincial, global, international governments, and federal governments are encouraging the industry to clean up their act, to bring down the emission intensity of bitumen development, and hence some of these headlines that you see here have to do with the emissions cap that is being imposed on the industry, the lack of energy, lack of market access for the commodity to be shipped to the outside markets. Also, some of the aspects have to do around the trade negotiations and how will Canadian oil and gas and oil sands industry will be impacted by the either scrapping of NAFTA altogether or some of the renegotiations that are happening. But despite all of this, oil sands production is still continuing to grow. According, if you don't believe us, which I will show you our forecast slide, International Energy Agency is forecasting oil sands production to grow to 3 million barrels per day by the end of this decade. All right, so if we can't figure out a way to grow the hydrocarbon industry, oil sands, crude oil, or natural gas, what sort of impact will it have on the Canadian economy? Well, it's huge. So Canadian oil and gas supports about 10% of total Canadian GDP, about 40% of this provincial revenue streams, but also supports lifestyle of many Canadians across the country. And so, as you can see, David McKay, who is the president of Royal Bank, in the latest publication on Business Council of Canada, had said that Canadians will see their standards of living fall and the economy falter if industry executives, First Nations, politicians, environmentalists cannot work together and collaborate to develop the country's largest non-renewable oil and gas resources. So we're not debating this point. There are significant benefits. However, as I mentioned earlier, it is not without its challenges. So these are some of the market conditions that we see that are currently unfavorable towards oil sands development in the sort of short to medium term. The low oil prices since mid-2014, when they crashed from over $100 a barrel to just below $40 a barrel, are not favorable for oil sands development, as production costs of oil sands are significantly higher than the current oil prices. There is some debate where the demand growth for crude oil around the world is going. There's some people that are suggesting that it's going to continue to grow in sort of outside of North American continent, in Asian countries and some of the other non-OECD developing countries. There's still a supply glut. There's still a large volume of inventory of crude oil that is either sitting and floating on water or in being stored away, and that is not helping the oil prices to increase. It's still sort of weakening and dampening that effect on the oil prices, which technically should already be increasing, what we normally see seasonally this time around. The U.S. shale production is doing, I guess, a catch-up because as OPEC announced their production cut, this is where the U.S. shale oil production stepped in and sort of taken in that gap that OPEC is trying to cut out of the market to able to hold the price at about $50 to $60 a barrel, but it's not happening. And again, more closer to home is market access. Yes, we still, currently the market is in balance. There's enough pipeline space to carry all the available supply for export outside of Western Canada. But as we get into the second decade, and if we are seeing the production from oil sands continue to grow as it did for the last 10 years, we're running into, again, not enough space on the current existing pipelines, and hence there's this sort of need for either figuring out how you can ship bitumen on existing pipelines without all that diluent that is needed to push the bitumen through the pipe, or figure out other ways, modes of transporting, either be it new pipeline, tankers on either West Coast or East Coast, or rail. All right, a little bit outside of things sort of around the market. Market conditions are something that industry doesn't really have full internal control over, but there are challenges that the industry and the supporting industry that supports the oil sands producers could address. And these have to do with, as I mentioned, high production costs. The oil sands barrel is still one of the largest emitting barrels to be produced, so it has a very high GHG profile. Social acceptance is a big one. How is industry dealing with the sort of damaged reputation around the world and locally? And this is a new one. The Alberta provincial government 2 years ago, year and a half ago, came out with a new climate change policy, climate change leadership plan, I should call it. And in it, there are specific items that will impact the oil sands industry. This have to do with increase in carbon tax. And the carbon tax is currently now went up from $15 to $20 a ton. January 2018 is going to go up to $30, and with the federally proposed tax of $50 in 2022, you will see that the carbon tax share of the cost of the barrel of bitumen to be produced is just going to increase if the producers are not dealing with their emissions profile. There's also another industry-wide environmental regulation, and this is the 100 megaton of CO2 equivalent cap. So industry as a whole currently sits at around 70 megatons of CO2 equivalent. So this 100 megaton cap would sort of only allows the room for that 30 additional megatons of CO2 to grow that industry. So what happens after that? So once they reach their 100 megaton, what does the industry do? Does it just shut down their projects and walk away? Well, what we're showing in some of our research that it's actually available. We actually can continue growing oil sands production without ever reaching the 100 megaton cap. And I'll get to that in a couple more slides. Methane emissions have to deal with sort of province-wide emitters of fugitive methane emissions that deal anything from the full supply chain from upstream oil and gas production all the way to natural gas and crude oil distribution. And again, oil sands does have some fugitive methane emissions profile, and that will have to be dealt with as well. And more globally, these are the International Marine Organization regulations on sulfur content of the bunker fuel. So that regulation stipulates that the current content of sulfur of 3.5% in the barrel or a liter of bunker fuel will now have to go down to 0.5%. So what impact will that have on the oil sands production is yet to see. There's not a large volume of Canadian bitumen and dilbit that goes out for production of residual or bunker fuel, but down the road it might have a significant impact. Actually, at the Institute right now, we're doing some research and trying to figure out what impact it will carry for future oil sands production. All right, but it's not all with challenges. There are opportunities, and this is one of them. So what you see here is the timeline of the technology development. These are the guys like you, bright minds in the room that create technology, that create new ways of extracting resources, that create new ways how to drill wells, how to apply robotics and various things. So from 1967, when oil sands research just started with the cyclic steam simulation technology, all the way to SAGD in sort of 80s, 90s, the first commercial SAGD SAGD project didn't come on board until 2004. So as you can see, it took over 20 years for that technology to develop. All the way to now, we're looking at various technologies that look at solvent-aided extraction of oil sands, where you'll use less natural gas to create steam, hence you'll have lesser emissions profile. But what we're seeing now is this acceleration of technology deployment. We're no longer seeing these 20-year lead years to have the technology be commercial. We're now seeing a faster movement of some of these, starting from the sort of concept idea, lab testing, all the way to the piloting it in the field, all the way to the commercial scale. And so what we're seeing and what we're stipulating in some of our research is that this is the answer. This is the answer to the 100 megaton cap and reducing the emission intensity of bitumen barrel. And I'll show you some of our results. Oh, just before I guess we jump into that, these are some of the economic impacts that have already materialized. Oil and gas sector in Canada is the single largest private sector in this country. So in 2014, Canadian government collected $15 billion in revenues in the form of royalty payments, land payments, bonus payments, and other tax revenues. And this industry employs more than 400,000 Canadians directly and indirectly across Canada. So it's just, the jobs are not just concentrated with the development of the resources in this province. It is sort of, the impact is, carries a domino effect, where what we're seeing is for each job that is created in Canadian oil and gas, 2 additional jobs are created in the support sector, 3 additional jobs are created on the induced impact, which is spreads out across the Canadian economy. All right, so this is our institute's forecast of oil sands production, where we're seeing it growing. Similar results in the sort of short to medium term. We do see production reach 3 million barrels by the end of the decade, and then continue to grow just above 5 million barrels by the end of the forecast period, which is approximately 20 years from now. We will be updating this forecast at the end of this year, but what we're probably not going to see some of that growth at the back. But all the stuff that is up front, these projects are already on the sort of in the line to go under construction and start producing bitumen. The production, as you see, is split between the project type. We're not going to see much of the oil sands mining being developed. We're just carrying the legacy and the existing operations from oil sands mining. The predominant growth is within in situ, either be it thermal development using natural gas or some sort of hybrid gas solvent technologies or pure solvent technologies. So will this production break the cap? Well, as I mentioned, the oil sands barrel is one of the highest in the world to produce. The Canadian dilbit sits at about just over $60 per barrel US for its supply cost, and it carries about 64 kilograms of CO2 equivalent for its emissions intensity. And as you can see, we want to go from somewhere here to somewhere here. All right, so what we've done is in one of our research reports, we looked at various scenarios. How can the oil sands industry achieve a continued growth in its production, but yet not reach that 100 megaton equivalent restriction? So what we've done is we ran 5 different cases for greenfield development and 1 for brownfield existing operation. And we sort of looked at the all the technologies and all the various processes that are currently available and will be available within the next 5 to 7 years. And we tried to figure out how we can apply this technology to various projects that are currently approved or being announced or under construction, and how we can bring them from the SAGD base, which you just saw on the previous chart, to somewhere around here where we're having a lower emissions profile and smaller supply cost. And just before I jump and give you the full emissions profile, this is the impact that the coal-fired, the emissions intensity related to the electricity generation that is needed for oil sands production. This will be the impact of the coal phase-out for the province of Alberta. As you can see, in 2030, that profile jumps from about 15 megaton of CO2 per year to just over above 10. So that's one. The methane emission reduction policy will also carry a significant impact. These are emissions related specifically just to oil sands production, not including all the other crude oil batteries or natural gas distribution. So as you can see, the yellow line shows, okay, well, the gray continuing of things, which is sort of as is. The emissions profile will be at about 2.5 megaton of CO2 per year, but with this methane reduction policy, what we're going to see is that emissions level regarding specifically to methane will approximately be halved by this new policy. So all in all, these 2 policies, the coal phase-out and methane, will create the top line. So the production forecast that you saw earlier will carry this emission profile, the top brown line. So what we're suggesting is, yes, the industry will reach its cap in about 2028 if it does not address its emission profile. And I can't stress this enough. This is the key to sort of succeed long term. And so what we've done is all those technologies, scenarios that you saw earlier, what we've done is we've adopted technology-specific emission profiles and costs, and we've adopted them to industry-wide profile. And as you can see, in all the 5 scenarios, whether it's a pure solvent technology, whether it's a steam solvent cogen with solid oxide fuel cells, or direct contact steam generation, all of these create scenarios where the production could be increasing at a level that I've shown you to about 5 million barrels per day, but the emissions cap is not being reached. So that's a good news. That's a positive news. So well, what does that all mean? Well, it means a lot, actually. So to carry on with the switching from technical to more economic impacts, this is a study that I just mentioned. This is what in front of you. What we've done is we looked at the economic impacts of continuing to develop Canadian oil and gas industry. Oil sands is included in it, and we are able to calculate, actually monetize, what the impacts are in terms of job count, GDP growth, compensation, and tax revenues for the government. So taking oil sands out of that general sort of Canadian oil and gas, these are economic impacts that are specifically related to oil sands development. So what we're suggesting is if oil sands industry and oil sands production is going to continue to grow to the level that you saw by 2027, the GDP impact will be measured, incremental GDP impact is about $1.7 trillion Canadian over the next 10 years, from 2017 to 2027. Within that, this is the Canadian GDP, 88% of that total impact will be in Alberta. And that makes sense. The oil sands resource is here. It is being developed here, and hence the majority of that impact is being felt in Alberta. The second largest beneficiary after Alberta, you will never guess. Throw some guesses out there. Ontario, province of Ontario. And the reason being is that there's a lot of, and this is a question I asked Mark, there's a lot of sort of labor and skills transferability, mobility that is happening. So some of these technologies Some of these machinery parts and valves and various, I'm not a technical person, but there's a lot going on in the production of oil sands. It's not just drilling a hole in the ground. So there are lots of different companies across Canada that are involved in the production of oil sands. And so after Alberta, at about 6% of total GDP benefit is the province of Ontario. After Ontario, it's Quebec, and only after Quebec, it's Saskatchewan. Employment is tremendous. It's about 4 million jobs. And jobs, it's basically a definition of 1 year job kind of thing. So 4 million jobs will be created. And as you can see at employment, the employment grows at from about 200,000 jobs per year in 2017 to about 450. And so if you were to add it up, it will add to about 4 million jobs. All right, so this is the same, the jobs, the same graph, except here now we're breaking it out by direct, indirect, and induced impact. Basically what that means, the blue bars are the people who are employed in the oil sands industry directly. So these are the oil sands producers. Here, the total number of jobs sits about half a million jobs for the total 10-year outlook. But the bigger impact is everything that sits above that. It's sort of these indirect jobs and induced. The indirect jobs are your service sector, the oil and gas service sector, the companies that provide machinery and equipment. The induced jobs are just your economy-wide jobs. So this would be a cashier that is working in Safeway, and the only reason is she's working there is because that Safeway has opened in Fort McMurray, and that oil worker that comes off from his shift goes to the store to buy something to eat, and that cashier is this induced impact, is that job that is being created as a result of oil sands development. And so all in all, and the same with federal and provincial taxes. As you can see, there's a clear correlation between the increase in the production and government revenues. They will never say no to their money, right? All right, so all in all, as I said, there's not a single province or territory in this country that is not impacted by the oil sands production. This is not very good. The majority of jobs will be felt in Alberta at about 3 million jobs, but the rest, you can, as you see, the province of Ontario, Quebec, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, British Columbia, they're all impacted, positively impacted in job creation. But that's not all. The benefits carry over to our largest partner down to the south is the United States. And so what we've done is Natural Resources Canada, when they've asked us to do this study, the big concern was around the NAFTA. Okay, well, what's going to happen if NAFTA is thrown out of the window? What impact will it have? Not just on, we understand the impact on Canada. What we don't understand is the impact it currently has on the United States. And it's nothing to laugh at. Yes, US economy is huge in comparison to Canadian economy, but it still has quite significant impact. So these impacts, the oil sands economic impacts, the way you interpret it, these are the oil sands companies or the service sector within the oil sands that goes to the United States to purchase goods and services from the US companies that would aid them, the Canadian companies, in the production of oil sands. So these are not exports. These are not the Canadian exports of crude oil, and this is refinery purchasing it and has some economic implications. These are the direct impacts. So the largest beneficiary of the oil sands development is, no surprise, is the state of Texas. But the 10 other ones are, you might find some surprising. California, all right, Florida. Interestingly enough, with Florida, the reason Florida is there, the largest sector that is impacted in Florida as a result of oil sands is the Florida's entertainment sector. Right? Makes sense, right? So, if oil sands companies are having some sort of soirees or get-togethers, they go to somewhere where they can bring their kids to Disneyland. But anyway. And so all the other states that are not shown here are being added up. And as you can see, there is a significant impact. Overall, U.S. impact on the gross state product is around $16 billion U.S., and the total employment creation is about 145,000 full-time equivalent jobs. This is just the oil sands. In your brochure, in your one-pager in front of you, you will see the total Canadian oil and gas impact. So this is just oil sands, but there is still conventional oil and natural gas, and that carries its own impacts, and that's in your handout there. Again, not a single state in the United States that is not impacted. Every single state has some job creation. Even the state of Alaska, where there's not shown here, has employment impact of 8 jobs. Okay, that's kind of neat. 40,000 jobs in the state of Texas. All right, I'll take that. All right, so just before I wrap it up, some of the concluding remarks. I know I was kind of like, jumping from here to there, but I hope in your I can sort of wrap it up around these concluding remarks. So what I was able to show you, and our research shows that there are clear pathways for significant cost and emission reductions in the oil sands industry, and the industry is moving there. Sort of anecdotal evidence, some of the producers I've talked to and some of the other members of PSAC and CAP Association are suggesting that the movement is happening and technology adoption is happening at a faster rate. Companies are taking a little bit more risk, for sure, but if you don't take the risk, you'll be the one that'll be left out of the game. We see reductions in supply costs anywhere from 12 to 46%, and the emissions reduction anywhere from, and don't let me lie, I have it right here, anywhere from 42% to 80% to some specific projects that show emission reduction to that extent. There's still significant room for oil sands production growth without reaching the regulated emissions cap. However, there's still factor or limitation that's standing in the way is this idea of de-risking promising technologies. We're not very good at marketing ourselves and selling our really good, felt good story, but we're also not very good at providing that support to the newcomers and to technology developers and proponents that might not be large oil sands developers or producers, but they have some really great ideas. And they can't take it to the market without the support of various organizations that Mark mentioned earlier, but also our provincial governments and federal governments, and also academia. University of Calgary and University of Alberta last year recently just received $150 million, $75 million each for doing exactly that. All right, and just some of the quick tidbits that you can start a conversation in a bar and say, hey, did you know for every one job created in oil sands, two additional jobs are created in the indirect sector and 3 in the induced. For every $1 million Canadian dollars that is invested into industry, Canadian GDP grows by 20% to 1.2 million, and the similar impacts on the US economy as well. And so the question of the day for you is oil sands a challenge or an opportunity? Or is it both? So do we want to find the solutions to reducing the production cost and the emissions to add additional almost $2 trillion to Canadian GDP, create additional 460,000 jobs? I say yes. All right, thank you very much for your time, and looking forward to your questions. A lot of it is locally grown, is sort of homegrown. A lot of it's coming from PSEC members, Mark's members, from service sector. Some of it is coming from the collaboration and collaborations with the industry, with academia, with the government, so through COSIA, the Canadian Oil Sands Industry Alliance, or through universities. The problem is we're not lacking ideas, we're not lacking, like just recently I read a newspaper, Ian Gates from University of Calgary, who runs Department of Petroleum Engineering at U of C, he created bitumen pellets, like little balls of bitumen that you can then ship. I mean, the ideas are everywhere. It's just a matter of how do you funnel them through the right channel for them to be able to be used at a commercial scale. I guess our role, our institute's role in this sort of Canadian oil and gas game is to provide and to disseminate factual information The report that I was drawing results from on technologies, for example, has a full list of technology names and proponents and companies that are looking for either, they're looking for support, financial support to get them to the sort of commercial scale, or they're looking for a partner. And these guys, like, I mean, I've done a few sort of sit downs where I say, okay, this person A, you need to meet person B. Okay, you're now in the same room, now you guys talk. You guys have something that you both will benefit from knowing one another. We are not a technology institute, so we do not do any sort of this fast tracking of technologies or anything, but Alberta innovates. Calgary innovates. The Alberta Research Council, which is now Alberta Innovates. University of Calgary, University of Alberta, COSIA. These are all the organizations that would, I think, will demonstrate a path how these various and they're not all the same, like you said. They're all going to be different. They're all going to have different stories that are associated with each development. So, right, so CAP is doing that work. I know because we've done some work for them. They know which companies in Houston, for example, that help oil sands producers who will provide legal environmental services, machinery, equipment, and things like that. CAP, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. They've done similar work. The trip that Mark mentioned, the trip to Washington that they had in August, CAP was there with them. And together, and I believe they were negotiating with specific state governors and then specific state sectors. And so CAP is more aware of specific companies. What I can do is I can pull the sectors from the data that we have, but I can't. The data does not go down to the company level. It just gives me a specific sector. So they will say machinery, Texas. Machinery sector carries this much of Canadian business to get. Oh, okay. If I can put you in touch with CAP. I can sit you guys at the same table.
Absolutely.
So
we'd like to disseminate all that information.
Absolutely.
So that we can have a bigger impact.
Definitely. Yeah. Let's sit down. You and I sit down, and we can figure out something. Yeah. Right. So yeah. No, you're right. Cogen, as in production of electricity and steam. The electricity, any electricity that is not used by the producer will be. It's assumed in our scenario that it will be sold back to the provincial grid, with a lesser emission intensity than versus coal. That's right. That's right. So I know for a fact that Alberta Energy Regulator has delayed one of the approvals of one of the solvent projects in the oil sands that are on the books right now because of that. Not sort of fully understanding. And the not understanding part is not going to happen until the first commercial solvent project goes ahead. So the not understanding part is everything underground, is how does the solvent behave. The big concern right now is what happens with all solvent that stays underground. How is it going to impact the integrity of the reservoir? How is it going to impact the underground water reservoirs? All of these questions are still being looked at by Alberta Energy Regulator. Okay, LNG and oil sands. I guess short answer is without the LNG, natural gas industry dies in this region of the country. Oil sands, electricity, power generation, even with coal replacement, petrochemical industry, these sectors all use natural gas, but they don't use natural gas in the amount to suggest there will be a significant upstream natural gas production as the LNG industry would dictate. So now with the recent announcement, one more project being canceled on the West Coast, it's tricky to say. In our analysis, we show that about mid-next decade, 2025, 2027, is when the demand for LNG outstrips the LNG supply. And so this is another window of opportunity that we're suggesting where Canadian LNG could fill in that gap. But for Canadian LNG to start exporting natural gas in 2025, these projects have to be on the books now and being sort of developed and having their feeds and everything to be completed and all the regulatory approvals to be approved for them to start construction and start producing. Because there's a bit of a lead way, 7 to 8 years before the project becomes online. It's not going to have, I think there's enough natural gas in this province to carry oil sands production, but for British Columbia as a sort of to grow the natural gas industry, they definitely need LNG. There's just not enough demand coming from the local industry. And our pipeline exports to the United States are dwindling as a result of the US shale gas production. And so LNG will be detrimental to upstream natural gas industry in Canada. Yeah. The 4 million jobs are strongly dependent on this industry to sustain itself and grow. So those are the sort of the assumptions that are built into the modeling. Those jobs are not going to happen if the industry doesn't grow. Let's just put it that way. On your comment on GTL technologies, you're right. I should have, I guess, brought in petrochemicals into this. Right now, the Alberta EDAC, this is the Economic Diversification. Alberta Diversification something committee. They're looking at how do you utilize methane molecule without LNG? Like what do you do? So there's been there's this push to grow a petrochemical industry in this province again, having to utilize methane in sort of methane to methanol, methane to olefins, methane to urea and ammonia. So all these other sort of secondary implementations of uses of methane will definitely help the natural gas producers, but again, not in a large sort of, we're talking 5 to 6 BCF per day that LNG industry would facilitate. All right. Did I take everybody's ear off? Thank you, Roger. Thank you.